and welcome to Jay Coletti's Racket Reviews. My name is Jay Coletti, and I will be your hostess. Here on Racket Reviews, we are dedicated to learning about all things organized crime, and today I'm really looking forward to having a discussion with you about another Jewish or kosher Nostra mobster who doesn't get enough coverage, and that's Louis Lepke Buchalter. Buchalter was the mobster who lived a fascinating life with a shocking conclusion. If you're enjoying the channel and would like to become a Racket Reviews patron, please head on over to that Patreon account and join the Coletti family. Now, without further ado, we have much to discuss, so let's get right to it. Louis Buchalter was born in Manhattan on February 6, 1897. He was the son of Barnett Buchalter, a Russian Jewish immigrant who came to the US and started a hardware store, and his wife Rose, who was described as refined and well-educated by the FBI. It was Rose who gave Louis his Yiddish nickname Lepke, later shortened to Lepke, meaning Little Louis. The Buchalter family was, with, of course, one notable exception, a law-abiding family of upstanding citizens. One of Buchalter's brothers went on to be a rabbi, another brother became a dentist, another became a professor, and another still became a pharmacist, and one of his sisters became a schoolteacher. Growing up, there is some conflicted reporting about where Buchalter attended school, but most sources agree that he attended Rabbi Jacob Joseph's School for Boys, although other sources contend that he attended public school. While in grade school, Buchalter made excellent grades. He was an honor roll student and helped his father work in his hardware store. Had the trajectory of Buchalter's life continued at this pace, it's likely that he would have been a man forgotten to history and only remembered by his loved ones, but he's on this channel, so we know that somewhere along the way, his life got off track. Barnett Buchalter died in 1909 when Lepke Buchalter was only 12 years old. After finishing his time in grade school in 1910, Buchalter would find work selling and distributing theatrical goods, props, costuming, and set dressings for theater productions. Buchalter's life continued to get worse when his mother moved to Arizona for medical treatment as she was unwell. Buchalter was left in the care of his elder sister who, it seems, was unable to console or control him. It was at this point that Buchalter began involving himself in crime. Likely thrown off of what would have been his natural course due to the death and the illness of his parents, Buchalter would start on the path that would make him a well-known name. Buchalter's criminal career started with burglary and assault. He was first arrested on September 2, 1915 on a burglary charge. He was released by a grand jury. About 4 months later, in January of 1916, Buchalter was arrested again for burglary. However, he was released a second time. Buchalter teamed up early with Jacob Shapiro, another famous Jewish mobster, when they were teenagers. Buchalter was a smaller man who didn't have much to offer in terms of intimidation. Shapiro, on the other hand, was a large, powerful man with a gruff exterior and a threatening presence. They worked together not only to rob pushcarts, but make these pushcart owners pay for protection from them as well. The story goes that the two met while attempting to rob the same pushcart. From there, they became fast friends and criminal partners. While this story is interesting, most historians agree that the two men did not meet while robbing the same pushcart. However, it would make for a terrific meet-cute moment in a Hollywood movie. Buchalter's criminal behavior came with consequences in February of 1916, when he was arrested again. This time he was charged with the theft of the grip from an automobile in Bridgeport, Connecticut. He had moved to Connecticut to live with his uncle. He was convicted and sentenced to the Connecticut Reformatory in Cheshire, Connecticut in May of that year. And he would remain there until July 12, 1917. He would not remain with his uncle long after his release. The two got into a conflict, and Buchalter returned to his home in New York City. On September 28, 1917, Buchalter would be sentenced in New York to 18 months in Sing Sing prison for grand larceny. Sing Sing prison would become a major part of Buchalter's life, and death, but we'll talk about that later. He was transferred to Auburn prison, where shortly thereafter, he would be released a few months early on January 27, 1919. But within a year, he was in hot water again. He would return to Sing Sing on January 22, 1920, after being convicted of attempted burglary. He was sentenced to 30 months in prison, but would be released on March 16, 1922. Throughout the 1920s, Buchalter would begin working with several Jewish, Italian, and Irish mobsters in extortion and labor racketeering specifically, although murder was also included in his criminal resume. Buchalter, Shapiro, and several others with whom they worked would take over the textile and garment workers' unions in New York City. Naturally, throughout the 1920s, they were involved in bootlegging and gambling alongside it, but this business also expanded into the narcotics trade. Buchalter and Shapiro would work under the patronage of labor racketeer Jacob Organ to get funding and standing for their business expansions. Buchalter and Shapiro had caught the eye of Jewish underworld investor Arnold Rothstein. the man who also had Organ's ear and had advised him to get involved with labor racketeering in the first place. Now, whether or not an upgraded benefactor in the form of Rothstein is what caused the following events to happen is unclear, but what we do know is that Buchalter and Shapiro had outgrown their use for Organ. Buchalter and Shapiro were the main suspects, although never convicted, in the murder of Jacob Organ on October 16, 1927, by way of a drive-by shooting. During the 1920s and even into the 1930s, Louis Buchalter would spend several stints in prison for various amounts of time for burglary, robbery, grand larceny, and consorting with criminals. Arnold Rothstein died in 1928, but Buchalter and Shapiro made such an impact and so much money that their empire continued to grow. By the early 1930s, they had expanded their racketeering far beyond the garment industry, which they had locked down, and into fur, poultry, trucking, baking, and artichoke distribution businesses, all industries rich with opportunities for extortion and union tampering. Along with Buchalter, Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, Dutch Schultz, and Albert Anastasia emerged as the new underworld players following Rothstein's death. Also in this group was Meyer Lansky, who had been a major player all along. Along with Anastasia, Buchalter would become the co-leader and founding father of Murder Incorporated. Murder Inc. served as the hit squad for the national crime syndicate that had been established by a multi-ethnic group of mobsters, most notably for our purposes today, Luciano, Costello, Lansky, Buchalter, Schultz, and Anastasia, although several others were key to the syndicate's founding. The National Crime Syndicate connected mostly Jewish and Italian organized crime from coast to coast. Most believe that the syndicate's founding took place at the Atlantic City Conference in 1929. Murder Inc. was one of the bloodiest criminal organizations to come out of the United States in the 20th century. If your name wound up on Murder Inc.'s list, that meant that U.S. organized crime was done negotiating with you. You were toast. Murder Inc. made it easier for mobsters to put out hits on their enemies without their name being traced back to the crime. Anastasia or Buchalter, the leader of the Italian and Jewish hitmen respectively, would receive a hit contract from Cosa Nostra, and then assign one of their hitmen to carry out the attack. This system worked almost flawlessly. The only problem would be if syndicate members had a disagreement about who should be hit, which we'll discuss in a moment. This group made its money from beating, mutilating, and of course, killing. An associate of Buchalter once said of him, "Lep loves hurting people." Contrary to how that description makes him seem, Buchalter was actually described as a pretty quiet and subdued man. In 1931, he would marry his wife Beatrice, who went by Betty Wasserman, and he would adopt Betty's child from a previous marriage. It appears that Buchalter never had biological children of his own. In 1935, the syndicate ran into a bit of a snag with Murder Inc. Dutch Schultz put in a contract to have New York District Attorney Thomas Dewey murdered, the same district attorney who would ultimately be responsible for Buchalter's downfall. When Luciano saw that Schultz wanted to have a district attorney murdered, he put a stop to the hit immediately. He believed it would bring down too much heat on their organization to take out a public official like Dewey. Schultz, furious, told Luciano that he would have Dewey taken out with or without syndicate approval, and that was a big mistake. As a response, Luciano passed to Murder Inc. the assignment to take out Schultz. This decision was finalized after 6 hours of deliberation, and the contract was handed to Buchalter, who would pass the assignment to his hitman, Charles Workman. Schultz was shot in Newark, New Jersey on October 23, 1935, and would die the next day. Workman was charged with the murder 6 years later in 1941. In 1936, Buchalter ordered the murder of Joseph Rosen, a candy store owner, but formerly a man who Buchalter had run out of business due to a labor racketeering dispute. Rosen, on multiple occasions, had threatened to go to the district attorney and tell him everything he knew about Buchalter's business tactics and illegal activities. Rosen was killed on September 13, 1936. Now, we haven't gone into the murders or the specific circumstances around the murders that took place with Murder Inc. If we did that, we would be here for weeks. So, why did I go into detail about Rosen? Well, I'm not going to tell you just yet, but I want you to keep in mind that this murder did take place. On November 8, 1936, both Buchalter and Shapiro were convicted of violating antitrust laws in the rabbit skin fur industry in New York. Dewey was the man who served as prosecutor in this case. After their convictions, but before they could be put behind bars, both Buchalter and Shapiro absconded. They were on the run from the law. Shapiro would eventually surrender to authorities on April 14, 1938, According to the FBI, Shapiro turned himself in because he was being so relentlessly followed that it was essentially like being in jail, so he gave up. When he turned himself in, Shapiro told law enforcement that Buchalter would be paying attention to how he made out before he made a decision about whether or not he would turn himself in. Buchalter was more determined to remain outside of law enforcement's grasp. By working through his closest associates, Buchalter went on a murdering spree of anyone he suspected of turning against him. He would remain on the run, jumping all over the continental United States, to Cuba, Mexico, Costa Rica, Puerto Rico, Canada, France, England, and Germany. He was also reported to have been in Poland and Palestine. On November 9, 1937, the federal government offered a $5,000 reward for information leading to Buchalter's apprehension. As Buchalter remained on the run, more and more charges began piling up against him. He was indicted for smuggling heroin into the United States and bribing customs agents. When District Attorney Dewey saw that the bodies of former Buchalter associates were piling up all over the city, he suggested that New York City offer a higher reward than the federal government for Buchalter's capture. The city agreed and offered a $25,000 reward for information leading to his capture on July 29, 1939. Finally, on August 24, 1939, in dramatic fashion, Buchalter surrendered directly to FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover himself. This surrender was apparently negotiated by radio broadcaster and gossip columnist Walter Winchell. Many attribute the connection with Walter Winchell to Mafia lore. It was reported at the time that Buchalter never left New York during his time as a fugitive, but according to the FBI, this manhunt was an international one. I'm inclined to believe that Buchalter was not hiding in New York City the entire time. I understand that the Big Apple is a busy place, but come on, they surely would have found him. Buchalter was found guilty of extortion in addition to the federal charge of drug trafficking. For his state charge of extortion, he was sentenced to 30 years to life, and for the federal charge, he was sentenced to 14 years. While serving his time for the federal charge first in Leavenworth, Kansas, Buchalter would be charged with the murder of a mob associate, but was never sent to trial or convicted for it. That might seem like the end of the story, and if it were any other mobster, it might very well have been that he remained in prison for the rest of his life and died of natural causes, but not with Buchalter. One of his top men, Abe Reles, had overheard Buchalter way back in 1936 sending the order to kill Rosen. Reles had apparently overheard incriminating information on Buchalter regarding 3 other murders as well. Reles turned state's evidence in 1940 and spilled the beans on his former boss. When Buchalter was brought to trial in Brooklyn, the testimony of another one of his former men, Albert Tannenbaum, sealed Buchalter's fate. Buchalter and 2 of his associates were found guilty of first-degree murder on November 30th, 1941. By December 2nd, 1941, the gavel had come down on Buchalter's sentencing. Death by electric chair. Buchalter's lawyers immediately filed an appeal, but the decision was upheld in October of 1942. The lawyers would then appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. SCOTUS, as it turns out, was not willing to play ball with Buchalter either. They upheld the decisions of the lower courts. Buchalter was turned over to the state of New York and sent to Sing Sing prison. Buchalter had begged for mercy and tried to get out of the sentencing, but there were no other legal pathways to overturn the decision. On March 4, 1944, Louis Buchalter was executed in Sing Sing's electric chair at the age of 47. He declined an opportunity to share any last words. Louis Buchalter is buried at Mount Hebron Cemetery in Queens, New York. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Racket Reviews discussing the action-packed life of Jewish mobster Louis Buchalter. I'll confess, before doing all of this research on Buchalter, I had no idea that there was so much Hollywood-level intrigue involved in his life. Although he's appeared on several mob documentaries and even received a shout-out on The Sopranos, it's simply criminal that he doesn't have a blockbuster movie of his own. Make sure to let me know in the comment section below or on Facebook and Twitter what you think about Buchalter. Also, don't forget to utilize that comment section in social media to let me know about who or what you would like to see covered next. I always love hearing from you, and I'm always happy to investigate. Make sure to like, subscribe, and click notifications to get more Mafia content sent directly to your sub box. Ciao.